Her father demanded she wear her finest silk to impress their mysterious, wealthy guest. Instead, Claire reached for her oldest, most faded dress. She had learned long ago that the easiest way to survive her father's ambitious alliances was to simply blend into the shadows, to become entirely invisible. But as she stepped into the freezing, misty courtyard, the towering stranger in the battered travel cloak didn't look past her. His piercing eyes locked onto hers, seeing right through her defenses. Claire thought she was just offering a moment of quiet kindness to a weary traveler. She had absolutely no idea she had just captured the undivided attention of the Alpha King. The summons came at dusk, when the first lamps were being lit along the long stone corridor of Ashford Manor. Claire's father found her in the herb garden, kneeling in the damp soil with her skirts tucked carelessly around her knees. She had been pulling the last of the marigolds before the frost took them, and her fingers were streaked with earth and the sharp green smell of crushed stems. "Claire," Edmund, Ashford's voice carried the weight of a man who was used to being obeyed. "There is a guest arriving tonight, an important one. I want you to change into your best dress and greet him at the gate with me." She looked up, shading her eyes against the low amber light. "Best dress, father?" "Yes, the green one, the one your mother left you." Claire did not argue. She never argued. But as she stood and brushed the soil from her palms, something quiet and familiar settled in her chest. A small, cold stone she had carried for so long she had almost forgotten it was there. Her best dress. The pale green silk that her mother had worn at her own wedding, the one that had been packed away in lavender in hope for a day that never seemed to arrive. She knew, without being told, that this guest was a man of consequence, a lord perhaps, or a messenger from one of the southern houses, someone who would look at her the way her father's guests always looked at her, with a polite, distant nod that said she was part of the furniture, part of the manor, part of the landscape that made Ashford look prosperous and well-kept. So she did not reach for the green silk. She stood in front of the worn oak chest in her chamber, ran her fingers over the folded layers of pale green, and then closed the lid gently and turned to the simple blue-gray dress hanging on the peg by the window. It was so think with age, patched at the elbow, in a way that Mara had sewn with neat, invisible stitches. It smelled faintly of wood smoke and dried rosemary. It was comfortable and true, and it did not pretend to be anything it was not. Claire wore her plainest dress to meet her father's guest because she had learned long ago that the important ones never really saw her anyway. Mara found her in the kitchen an hour later, tightening the laces on her worn leather boots. The old cook was stirring a pot of something that smelled of onions and thyme and patience, and she did not turn around when she spoke. "You're wearing that." "I am." "Your father," said the green one. "My father will be too busy looking at his guest to notice what I have on." Claire stood and tested the boot, wiggling her toes. "And if he does notice, he will be angry either way. At least this way I will be comfortable while he is angry." Mara snorted. She turned, wiped her hands on her apron, and gave Claire a long, appraising look. "Dog does not mind a shabby coat when the hearth is warm," she said. "But people are not dogs, and guests are the worst kind of people. Is that one of your proverbs?" "It is a warning." Mara picked up a wooden ladle and pointed it at her. "This guest, I hear, is someone big. Your father has been pacing the hall all afternoon, muttering about alliances and trade routes and the price of wool. He is not this nervous about just any lord." Claire's stomach gave a small, quiet turn. "Then I should have worn a bean one." "You should have worn whatever you wanted to wear, child." Mara's voice softened. "That is the whole point of being alive. Now come here and try this soup before I have to serve it to a king." Claire laughed, a small, surprised sound. "A king? Did I say king?" "I said sambar. Think big. My tongue runs ahead of my sense when the onions are strong." Mara ladled a spoonful of the golden broth and held it out. "Taste. Tell me if it needs salt." Claire tasted. It needed salt. She said so, and Mara grumbled and reached for the salt crock. And for a moment the kitchen was warm and normal, and the cold knot in Claire's chest loosened just a little. She was wiping the last of the dishes when she heard the horses. They came up the long gravel drive at a steady walk, the sound of hooves muffled by the evening mist that rolled in from the river. Claire set down the cloth and moved to the kitchen window, wiping a clear circle in the steam on the glass. There were 3 riders, Two of them were clearly escort broad-shouldered men in plain dark cloaks who kept their hands close to their saddles. The third, the one in the middle, sat his horse with an easy, unhurried stillness that made Claire think of a man who had ridden a very long way and was in no particular hurry to arrive. He was wearing a deep gray traveling cloak, the kind that had seen weather and mended itself with dust. His hair was dark, cropped short against the cold. Even from this distance, through the mist and the fading light, there was something about the way he held himself that made Claire's breath catch for no reason she could name. "Here they come," Mara said from the hearth without turning. "Go on, child. Your father will be looking for you." Claire wiped her hands on her apron, then remembered she was not wearing an apron, and wiped them on her hips instead. She took a breath. She smoothed her skirt, which did not need smoothing, and she walked out through the kitchen door and into the cold, misty evening. Just as the stranger in gray was dismounting in the courtyard, her father was already there, his voice loud and welcoming in the way it always was when important people came. "Lord Blackwood, welcome, welcome. The roads were kind, I trust?" The stranger inclined his head. "Kind enough, Lord Ashford. The fog is thick near the river." "Ah, the river fog. It will clear by morning. Come in, come in. There is a fire in the hall and food on the table." My daughter, Edmund turned, his eyes finding Claire with a flicker of something that might have been surprise that she was already there. "Claire, come and greet our guest." Claire stepped forward. The gravel crunched under her old boots. The mist curled around her ankles like a cat. And the stranger turned to look at her. And for the first time in her life, a guest's eyes did not slide past her. He looked at her, really looked. His gaze rested on her face, on the faded blue-gray of her dress, on her hands which were still faintly stained with earth from the garden. There was no disdain in his eyes, no polite dismissal, just a quiet, curious attention, as if she were a page in a book he had not expected to find. "Lord Blackwood," she said, and dropped into a curtsy that was a beat too slow and a breath too shallow. "Welcome to Ashford. Thank you." His voice was lower than she expected, rough at the edges, like the bark of an old tree. "You are working in the garden?" She blinked. Yes. The marigolds, before the frost." "Marigolds." He said the word as if he were tasting it. "They are good for healing. The petals, crushed and mixed with lard, good for scrapes." Claire stared at him. "You know about marigolds, my lord?" "My mother did." He said it simply, without weight, and then he turned to Edmund, and the moment was gone, folded away into the ordinary business of a guest being welcomed into a Billy Bin player did not forget it. She stood in the courtyard as the servants took the horses and the mist thickened, and the lamps glowed orange through the windows of the manor. She stood there long enough that the cold crept through her old dress and into her bones. He knew about marigolds. He had a mother who taught him. And when he had looked at her, he had not seen the faded hem of her dress or the earth under her fingernails. He had seen her, the way you see a person when you are not in a hurry to look past them. That night, at the long table in the great hall, Claire sat at the far end, as she always did. The guest sat at her father's right hand, and they spoke of wool and rivers and the price of timber. And Claire ladled soup and passed bread, and tried not to look at the stranger's hands. He had good hands. Strong, with long fingers and a thin white scar across the back of one of them, the kind of scar that came from a blade or a rope or something sharp. He ate neatly, without the greedy hunger of a man who has been riding all day, and he listened more than he spoke. Once he glanced down the table and found Claire watching him, and he did not look away. He simply raised his cup, a small, almost imperceptible gesture of acknowledgement, and drank. Claire felt heat rise to her cheeks and busied herself with the bread basket. Later, when the hall had emptied and the servants were clearing the plates, Claire carried a small clay bowl of honeyed milk to the guest's chamber door. It was a habit her mother had taught her for guests who had traveled far. She set it on the floor, knocked once, and hurried away before anyone could open the door and see her standing there in her plain blue-gray dress with her hands clasped behind her back. She did not see him open the door. There, she did not see him pick up the bowl, or the way his brow furrowed as he looked at the steam rising from the warm, sweet milk. She only heard, faintly through the heavy oak door, a sound she could not quite name. It might have been a breath. It might have been a laugh. It might have been the wind in the eaves. Claire walked back to her own small chamber, sat on the edge of her bed, and pulled out the old book of pressed flowers from beneath her pillow. The dried bellflower lay between its pages, pale and fragile. the last flower her mother had taught her to name before the fever took her. She touched it with one fingertip, very gently. "Bellflower," her mother had said, her voice thin as autumn light. "It means returning home? You remember that, Claire? You remember that the ones who love you always find their way back." Claire closed the book and lay back on the bed, still in her plain blue-gray dress, staring up at the dark ceiling. Somewhere down the hall, a stranger from a far place was drinking honeyed milk in a guest chamber, and she did not know his name, and he did not know hers. But he had looked at her like she mattered, and Claire could not stop thinking about the way that felt. The honeyed milk sat untouched on the small table outside the guest chamber when the first gray light of dawn crept through the corridor windows. Alexander opened his door, saw the bowl, and stopped. He had not slept well. That was not unusual. What was unusual was the warmth that rose in his chest at the sight of that simple clay bowl, the milk still faintly steaming in the cool morning air. He picked it up, turned it in his hands, and drank it standing there in the doorway, alone in the half-dark. It was not the first time a woman had left him food. Servants did it all the time. But this was different. This bowl had not been placed by a servant following orders. It had been placed by the girl in the plain blue-gray dress, the one who had looked at him as if he were merely a tired traveler and not something to be feared or flattered. He set the empty bowl back on the table and walked toward the great hall, where the smell of wood smoke and fresh bread drifted up from the kitchens below. Claire woke before the dawn bell, as she always did. She lay still for a moment, listening to the familiar sounds of the house stirring around her, the creak of floorboards, the distant clatter of pots, the low murmur of servants beginning their day. Then she remembered the stranger in the guest chamber, and her stomach tightened. She had not meant to leave the milk. It had been an impulse, a habit inherited from her mother, who had always said that no guest should wake to an empty stomach in a cold room. But now, in the pale morning light, the gesture felt foolish. What would a lord from some distant holding think of a servant's daughter leaving him warm milk like a nursemaid tending a child? She pulled on her dress, the same blue-gray one, and went down to the kitchen. Mara was already there, flour up to her elbows, kneading dough with the fierce efficiency of a woman who had been feeding hungry men for 40 years. She looked up when Claire entered and grunted. "Up early," she said. "Couldn't sleep? Or are you thinking about the fine lord in the guest chamber?" "I wasn't thinking about him," Claire said too quickly, and Mara's eyebrows rose. That's what the cat says when she's been at the cream." Claire felt her cheeks warm. She busied herself with the kettle, setting it over the fire, measuring out tea leaves with careful attention. I left her diked milk outside his door last night. Mother used to do that." Mara's hand stilled for just a moment. Then she resumed, kneading, her voice softer. "Your mother had a good heart. She knew that a warm welcome isn't about grand gestures. It's about the small things that tell a person they're not alone." Claire said nothing. She watched the water begin to simmer, and thought about the way the stranger had looked at her the night before. Not with the dismissive courtesy of a lord addressing a servant, but with genuine interest, as if he were actually seeing her for the first time. "Blackwood," she said quietly. "That's his name. Lord Blackwood." "Aye," Mara said. "Your father's been talking of little else since the invitation went out. A powerful man, they say. Some kind of northern lord, with land and soldiers to spare." She paused, wiping her hands on her apron. "Strange, though." "What is?" Mara shrugged. "I've been in this kitchen for 30 years, girl. I've served kings and beggars, and I can tell you this. That man doesn't move like a minor lord. He moves like someone who's used to being obeyed without question." Claire frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean, he stood at the end of that table last night and watched everything like a hawk on a fence post. Not the way a guest watches, curious about the household, the way a man watches when he's measuring something." Mara shook her head. "But maybe I'm just an old woman with too much time to think?" Claire carried the tea tray toward the great hall, the conversation lingering in her mind. She found her father already seated at the head of the long oak table, a plate of bread and cheese before him, a map spread across the wood beside his cup. He looked up when she entered, and the crease between his brows deepened. "Claire. Good. There you are." He gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit. I want to talk to you before our guest comes down." She set the tray down and obeyed, folding her hands in her lap. Her father did not often ask her to sit with him. When he did, it was usually to remind her of some duty she had neglected or some expectation she had failed to meet. "I want you to be more present today, Edmund said, his eyes still on the map. Lord Blackwood is an important man, a potential ally, the kind of connection that could secure our borders for a generation. I don't understand what you want me to do, Claire said carefully. Her father finally looked up. His expression was not unkind, but it was distant, the way it always was when he was thinking about matters that did not include her. I want you to be gracious, to help make him feel welcome. You have a way with people, Claire, more than you know. Your mother had it too. She could make anyone feel at ease, no matter their rank. Claire felt a small, unexpected warmth at the mention of her mother. I'll do my best, Father. Good. He returned his attention to the map. We'll walk the estate today. Show him the fields, the herds. After that, we'll see. She nodded and rose, but he spoke again before she reached the door. Claire. She turned. He was looking at her now, and for a moment something flickered in his eyes, something almost like regret. That dress, it's fine. There's nothing wrong with it. It was the closest thing to approval he had given her in months. Claire managed a small smile and left the hall before he could see how much it meant. The morning unfolded in a pattern Claire had grown used to, the steady rhythm of a household preparing for a guest's comfort. She helped Mara with the bread, swept teeth, think about himself and Tekund, and carried fresh water to the guest wing. The door to the guest chamber was open, and she saw that the bed had been made with military precision, the blankets drawn tight and square. She stood in the doorway for a moment, struck by how impersonal the room looked. The stranger had left no trace of himself, no clothes laid out, no books on the table, only the empty clay bowl she had left the night before set neat at the edge of the washstand. He had drunk the milk. The realization sent a small, unexpected flutter through her chest. She picked up the bowl and turned to leave and nearly collided with him in the doorway. He was standing there in his dark gray traveling clothes, his hair still damp from washing, his gray-blue eyes fixed on her with an expression she could not read. Up close, she noticed the faint scar at his left brow, the deep lines around his mouth that spoke of years of strain, the way his shoulders seemed to carry a weight that was not physical. "Oh," she said, stepping back quickly. "I'm sorry, my lord, I didn't mean to—" "You drank it," he said, and his voice was quieter than she expected. "The milk, I drank it." She stared at him, and then, absurdly, she felt herself begin to smile. "I'm glad. I wasn't sure if it would be welcome." "It was." He said it simply, without flattery or excess. "It was the first thing anyone has given me in a long time without wanting something in return." Claire did not know what to say to that. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but full of something unspoken. She clutched the empty bowl to her chest like a shield. "I should take this to the kitchen," she said finally. "Yes, of course." He stepped aside to let her pass, but as she moved by him, he spoke again. "Your fath, and she's manage. We'll be walking the estate today. Will you join us?" She turned, surprised. "Me? I'd like to hear about the land from someone who actually knows it," he said, "not just from a lord with a map." Claire hesitated. It was unusual, she knew, for a guest to request the company of a daughter rather than the lord himself. But his expression was open, expectant, without a trace of mockery. I could show you the river path," she said. "There's a bend where the kingfishers nest. My mother used to take me there." The faintest smile touched his mouth. "Then I would be honored to see it." He left her standing in the corridor, the empty bowl still pressed against her chest, her heart beating a little faster than it should have. The afternoon walk was unlike anything Claire had expected. Her father led the way through the fields with the brisk efficiency of a man conducting business, pointing out acreages and yields, discussing boundary lines and grazing rights. Alexander walked beside him, listening attentively, asking occasional questions that were sharper than they first appeared. But it was Claire he kept glancing at. She noticed it at first, out of the corner of her eye, the way his attention would drift toward her when her father was mid-sentence, landing on her face, her hands, the way she moved through the tall grass. When she caught him looking, he did not look away. He simply held her gaze for a moment, then returned his focus to the conversation. It was disarming. She was not used to being looked at like that, as if she were worth the effort of attention. When they reached the river bend, her father wandered ahead to inspect a fence line, leaving them alone on the bank. The water moved past them, clear and cold, and a kingfisher darted from the reeds in spine. A flash of blue. "It's beautiful here," Alexander said, and she could not tell if he meant the river or something else. "My mother used to say that this was where the world felt most honest," Claire said. "No titles, no walls. Just water and sky and the sound of the wind in the reeds." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She sounds like a wise woman." She was. Claire looked down at her worn shoes. "She died 5 years ago. A fever took her. I'm sorry." The words were simple, but there was something in the way he said them that made her look up. His gray-blue eyes were soft, unguarded in a way she had not seen before. "Do you think about her often?" he asked. "Every day," Claire admitted. "Some days it hurts less. Some days it feels like she's still just around the corner waiting to tell me something I've forgotten to remember." He nodded slowly, and she saw something shift in his expression, a flicker of recognition, of shared understanding. "My mother died when I was young," he said. "I don't remember much about her, just small things, the way she hummed when she worked, the smell of her—" He stopped, shook his head. "Forgive me, I don't usually speak of such things." "It's all right," Claire said softly. "You don't have to carry it alone." He looked at her then, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. The river moved past them unhurried, and the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grass. "Thank you," he said finally, "for the milk, for this." He gestured vaguely at the river, the sky, the space between them. "For making me feel like a person again." Claire did not know how to answer that, so she simply smiled, and they stood together on the riverbank, two strangers keeping company in the quiet afternoon light. That evening, when she returned to her chamber, Claire pulled out the old book of pressed flowers and turned to the page where the dried bellflower lay. She touched it gently, the way she had touched it every night since her mother died, and she thought about the stranger with the gray-blue eyes and the weight he carried. Returning home, she whispered to the empty room, "That's what you said, Mother, that the ones who love us always find their way back." She did not know why she thought of it now, but as she closed the book and lay back on her bed, she felt a small, stubborn hope blooming in her chest. A hope that perhaps, in some way, she did not yet understand, something was beginning to find its way toward her. And somewhere in the guest wing, a man who was not Lord Blackwood lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, thinking about a girl in a plain blue-gray dress who had asked him nothing, expected nothing, and given him everything without knowing it. The rain came without warning. One moment the afternoon sky over Ashford estate was a pale, tired blue, the kind that lingered after a long autumn. The next, the clouds rolled in thick and heavy, and the first fat drops began to fall, drumming against the oak leaves like impatient fingers. Alexander had walked farther from the manor than he intended. He had told himself he was surveying the land, the fences, the orchards, the way the fields sloped toward the river. It was what a visiting lord ought to do after all, but the truth was simpler and less dignified. He had wanted to be away from the manor, away from the careful looks and the measured words, and he had walked until the walls of Ashford were small behind him. Now the rain found him on a narrow path between two hedgerows, with no shelter in sight except a low stone wall and a row of think old oaks. He pulled his travel cloak tighter and kept walking, because stopping felt like surrender, and he had been taught never to surrender. The path curved, and then he saw her. Claire was standing in the middle of the lane, holding a wicker basket over her head in a futile attempt to keep the rain off her hair. Her braid was already dark with water, and her blue-gray dress was soaked at the hem, clinging to her boots. She looked up when she heard his footsteps, and her eyes widened. "My lord," she said, dropping into a quick curtsy. "You're caught in the rain." "So are you," he said, and he did not mean it as a jest, but something in her expression softened anyway. "I was fetching eggs from the far coop," she said, nodding at the basket. "Mara wants to make a custard for tonight. She'll scold me if I come back empty-handed." He looked at the basket, then at the sky, which had darkened to a bruised gray. "You'll be drenched before you reach the kitchen." "I'll be drenched either way," she said. Then she hesitated, the way she always did when she was about to say something she feared might overstep. There's a small shed by the garden wall. It's not much, but it has a roof and a dry bench, if you'd like to wait out the worst of it." He should have declined. He had a duty to return to the manor, to change into dry clothes and prepare for the evening's conversation with Edmund. Every moment he spent standing in the rain with the Lord's youngest daughter was a moment he was not doing what he had come here to do. But the rain was cold, and her voice was gentle, and he was very tired of doing what he was supposed to do. "I would be grateful," he said. She led him off the path, through a gap in the hedge, and there it was, a small stone shed with a sagging wooden door and a roof of mossy shingles. The garden around it had gone to seed for the winter, but someone had swept the threshold clean. She pushed the door open and gestured him inside. It was barely larger than a horse stall. A narrow bench ran along one wall, and above it hung a few rusted tools and a coil of rope. The air smelled of dry earth and old straw. Claire set her basket on the floor and looked around, as if seeing the place for the first time. "It's not much," she said again, apologetic, "but it keeps the rain out." "It does," he said, and he meant it. He sat down on the bench, and the wood creaked under his weight. His cloak was dripping onto the packed earth floor, and he could feel the cold seeping into his shoulders. She stood in the doorway, half in and half out of the rain, and studied him with that quiet, searching look she had. It was the same look she had given him the first night, when she had set the bowl of soup before him and said, "You look tired. Do you have a fire?" he asked, to break the silence. "No," she said, "but there's dry kindling in the corner, and I know how to make a small one without smoke. It won't be warm, but it'll be warmer than this." Before he could protest, she was on her knees, arranging a handful of twigs and dried leaves in a shallow iron pan she had found behind the door. She struck a flint with practiced ease, and a thin wisp of smoke curled up, then a small flame. She fed it carefully, piece by piece, until it was steady. He watched her, fascinated in a way he could not name. She did not look up, but she said, "My father taught me. He said, a person who can start a fire in the rain will never be helpless. Your father was a wise man." "He was," she said quietly. "He died when I was 14. He used to say, a fire is the only gift a poor man can give that costs him nothing but time." Alexander said nothing. He was not used to being given things, not like this, not without expectation. In the world he came from, every kindness had a price, even if the price was deferred. But this girl, kneeling in the dirt of a garden shed, coaxing a flame to life so that he might be a little less cold, she asked for nothing. She asked for nothing. "There's an old cloak on that hook," she said, nodding toward the far wall. "It was my father's. It's coarse, but it's dry. You could use it while your own dries by the fire." He should have refused. He was a king. He did not take cloaks from dead men in garden sheds, no matter how kind the hands that offered them. But he was cold, and she was looking at him with those steady brown eyes, and something in his chest had gone soft and quiet, like a bruise that had finally stopped hurting. "Thank you," he said, and he was surprised by how rough his own voice sounded. He took the cloak from the hook and shrugged it over his shoulders. It was heavy wool, the color of old ash, and it smelled faintly of wood smoke and dried lavender. It was the cloak of a man who had worked with his hands, a man who had stood in fields and watched the sky and known the weight of an honest day's labor. He pulled it tight around him, and the warmth settled into his bones like a memory. Claire sat down on the floor beside the little fire, hugging her knees. Her dress was still wet, and she was shivering a little, but she made no move to take the cloak back. She simply sat there, watching the flames, her face soft in the firelight. "You look tired," she said after a long moment. "When I first saw you by the door that night, I don't mean it as an offense. I noticed." He looked, "Thinker, and what did you see?" She was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "I saw a man who carries something heavy. Not a pack, not a saddlebag. Something he doesn't set down even when he sleeps." The words landed harder than any blow. He had been seen, truly seen. And it was not the sharp, probing gaze of a courtier looking for weakness. It was the quiet, unassuming notice of a girl who simply paid attention. "You are very observant," he said. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I shouldn't have—" "No," he said. "Don't apologize. It's been a long time since anyone noticed anything about me other than what I can do." She looked at him then, and there was no pity in her eyes. Only a calm, steady warmth. What you can do is important, she said, but it's not all you are. The fire crackled between them. Outside, the rain had softened to a steady patter, and the light was fading toward dusk. He had been away from the manor for hours. Edmund would be wondering where he had gone. The world was waiting for him, as it always was. But for a moment he let himself sit in the small, dry shed with the smell of lavender and wood smoke, and he did not want to leave. "What about your boots?" she said, suddenly breaking the spell. "My boots? They're soaked through. If you sit in them, you'll catch a chill." She was already reaching for a dry rag from the shelf. "Take them off. Let them dry by the fire." He stared at her. "You want me to take off my boots?" "I want you to not be cold," she said simply. "It's not a complicated request, my lord." He laughed. It was a small, rusty sound, barely more than a breath, but it was a laugh, the first genuine one he had let out in months. She heard it, and a smile flickered at the corner of her mouth. He pulled off his boots and thanked them by the fire, and she draped the rag over them to catch the worst of the water. Then she sat back down, hugging her knees again, and they watched the flames together. "Tell me about this land," he said, because the silence had grown comfortable and he did not want it to end. So she talked. She told him about the oak trees that had stood on the hill for longer than anyone could remember, about the river that flooded every spring and left rich filth behind, about the old mill that had been abandoned after the miller's son went off to war and never came back. She told him about the fox that had been stealing chickens from the far coop, and Mara's elaborate plans to catch it, and the way the village children had taken to leaving it bread crusts. She told him nothing important. She told him everything, and he listened. When the rain finally stopped, the world outside had gone quiet and gray, and the air smelled of wet earth and leaves. Claire stood up, brushing the dust from her skirt, and looked out the door. "We should go back," she said. "Mara will worry." He pulled on his boots, still warmed from the fire, and handed her father's cloak back to her. "Thank you," he said, "for all of it." "It was nothing," she said. "A dry place to wait out the rain? Anyone would have done the same." "No," he said, and his voice was quieter than he intended. "They wouldn't have." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she smiled, a small, real smile, the kind that reached her eyes. "Well," she said, "you're welcome, my lord. Next time I'll make sure the roof doesn't leak." He laughed again, and this time it was easier. They walked back to the manor side by side, and the wet grass soaked their boots, and the evening birds began their first tentative songs. He did not know what think he was doing here, in this quiet corner of the world, with this girl in a plain dress who asked for nothing. But for the first time in a very long time, he did not feel like a king. He felt like a man. That night, in the guest room, Alexander sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his hands. There was a faint smudge of ash on his knuckles from the fire she had built, and he did not wash it off. He thought about her father's cloak, and the way it had smelled of lavender and wood smoke. He thought about the way she had knelt in the dirt without a second thought, striking flint until the flame caught. He thought about the way she had said, "You looked tired," as if it were the most natural thing in the world to notice such a thing. He had been given many gifts in his life, lands, titles, the obedience of men who would never dare defy him. But no one had ever given him a dry cloak and a small fire and asked for nothing in return. He lay down on the bed, still thinking of her, and the weight he always carried seemed for once a little lighter. Somewhere in the manor, in a small room with a window that faced the garden, Claire lay awake too. She was thinking about the stranger with the gray-blue eyes and the way he had laughed in the shed, a sound so unexpected it had made her heart ache. She did not know who he was. She did not know why he carried such a heavy thing inside him, but she knew he had needed that small fire, and she was glad she had been the one to build it. The morning after the rain, the manor woke to the smell of wood smoke and the sharp, sweet tang of apples being pressed for cider. Autumn harvest was 3 days away, and the whole of Ashford Manor hummed with the kind of purposeful chaos that made Claire feel useful and small at the same time. She was in the kitchen helping Mara roll out dough for the festival pies, when her father's voice boomed through the hall. "Claire, where is that girl? Claire!" She wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron and hurried to the doorway. Edmund Ashford stood there, red-faced and already impatient, a list clutched in his hand. "The spice merchant owes me a favor, and I need someone to collect the order before he sells the good saffron to someone else. You will go to the market today." Claire blinked. Me? You are the only one who does not dawdle. Take the cart, take the coin, come straight back. And for the love of the old gods, wear something that does not make us look like we are begging." He thrust the coin purse into her hands and was gone before she could answer. She looked down at the worn leather pouch, then at her blue-gray dress with its faded hem. It was the plainest thing she owned. She did not mind. The market was her favorite place in the whole world. An hour later, she was leading the old cart mare down the lane that wound toward the village square when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned, and there he was, the guest from the manor, Lord Blackwood, walking with his long, easy stride, his deep gray cloak thrown over one shoulder. "Good morning," he said, and there was something almost shy in the way he said it. "Good morning, my lord. Are you walking to the village? I was told the market is worth seeing." He fell into step beside her, and the mare flicked in gear but did not complain. "And I find I am tired of being indoors." She did not ask why a nobleman would want to see a common market. She simply nodded and said, "Then you shall see it. But I must warn you, the spice merchant haggles like a man who has never lost an argument." Alexander smiled. A smell like all real smile that softened the hard lines of his face. "I have met men like that. I am still standing." The village square was a riot of color and noise. Stalls overflowed with late apples, woven wool, clay pots, and strings of drying peppers. A butcher called out his prices. A group of children chased a runaway chicken. An old woman sold honey in tiny wooden cups, and the air was thick with the smell of French bread and wood smoke. Claire led the cart to the spice stall, where the merchant, a thin, quick-eyed man named Silas, was indeed waiting with a sack of saffron and a look of profound grievance. "Miss Ashford," he said, not warmly, "your father's order. Took me 3 weeks to get this saffron, and he wants it at the old price. Daylight robbery, that is." "The old price was agreed last spring," Claire said gently. "My father is a man of his word, Master Silas. Surely you would not want him to think otherwise." The merchant grumbled but handed over the sack. As she counted out the coins, a commotion erupted at the edge of the square. A crowd had gathered around a man with a wicker basket, and from the basket came a low, angry hiss. "Step right up," the man bellowed. "See the serpent of the southern marshes. For a single coin you may watch it dance." Claire's coin purse was already light, but she was curious. She edged closer, and the snake charmer, a swarthy man with a gold tooth, spotted her. His eyes lit up. "Ah, a pretty lass. Come, miss, let the serpent see your face. It brings luck to the fair ones." Before she could step back, he reached out and grabbed her wrist. The snake in the basket rose, swaying, and the crowd gasped. "Let her go," said a quiet voice behind her. The snake charmer looked up, still grinning. "And who might you be, friend?" "This is mad between the lady and—" "I said let her go." Alexander's voice had not risen. It had dropped instead, a low, cold thing that seemed to suck the warmth out of the air. He was not wearing a sword. He did not need one. The snake charmer's grin faltered, and his hand fell away from Claire's wrist as if burned. "She was only having a bit of fun," the man muttered. "She was not laughing?" Alexander stepped between them, his gray-blue eyes flat and unreadable. "The serpent of the southern marshes is a grass snake, friend. It has no venom, and it dances because you have been pinching it. The only thing being tricked here is the crowd." A ripple of laughter ran through the onlookers. The snake charmer flushed, scooped up his basket, and disappeared into the crowd with a muttered curse. The crowd dispersed, and Claire found herself standing alone with Alexander, her heart beating a little fast. "Thank you," she said. "I did not think you would—" "I was not—" She stopped, because she was not sure what she had been about to say. "You were being kind," Alexander said. "You were trying to see what he was doing, and he mistook your curiosity for something else. It happens to kind people more often than it should." She looked up at him, and for a moment she saw something flicker behind his eyes, something tired and old and unexpectedly gentle. "Come," she said, because she did not know how to answer that. "There is a woman here who makes the best honey cakes in the county. I will buy you one." They wandered the market for another hour. Claire showed him the stall where the old bookbinder required worn volumes, the corner where the goat cheese came from the high pastures, the little bench by the fountain where she had eaten her lunch as a girl. He listened to all of it with a quiet attention that made her feel for the first time in a long while that what she said mattered. At the honey stall, the old woman who ran it peered at Alexander with sharp, bright eyes. "You are not from here," she said. "No," he said. "I am passing through." "Passing through," she repeated, and she laughed a wheezy laugh. "A man with your boots does not pass through. He goes where he pleases, and the world makes room." She slid a honey cake onto a piece of waxed paper and handed it to him. "You look like a man who has forgotten what sweet tastes like." Alexander took the cake. He looked down at it, and something in his face shifted. A crack in the stone, a loosening of the rigid line of his jaw. "Thank you," he said quietly. Claire bought a small bundle of dried flowers from a girl at the edge of the square, blue cornflowers and yellow tansy, tied with a bit of twine. She tucked them carefully into her basket, and Alexander noticed. "You collect flowers?" "Dry ones," she said. "I press them in books. It is a small thing, but it reminds me of the days they came from." "Which flower is your favorite?" She hesitated. Then she reached into the pocket of her dress and drew out a single pressed bloom. Its white petals faded to pale ivory, its stem still curved with the memory of the stalk it had grown on. "Lily of the valley," she said. "My mother taught me to recognize it when I was very small. She said it means return, that the ones who love you always come back, even when you cannot see them yet." Alexander looked at the flower for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was careful, as if he were walking on ice. "My mother used to say something like that," he said. "Not about flowers, about winter. She said winter never lasts, because the earth always remembers the things where the sun lives." Claire looked up at him. The afternoon light caught the edge of his face, and she saw, for just a moment, the boy he must have been. A boy who had been taught to carry a heavy thing, and had never quite put it down. "She sounds wise," Claire said softly. She was. He handed the pressed flower back to her, his fingers brushing hers for the briefest instant. "Thank you for showing it to me." They walked back to the manor in the lengthening shadows of the afternoon. The cart rattled behind them, heavy with saffron and honey and dried flowers. Alexander carried a small parcel of honey cakes wrapped in waxed paper, and he had not eaten a single one. He was saving them. He did not know why, but he wanted to save them. As they passed through the manor gate, Edmund was waiting on the steps, his face tight with impatience. "There you are. I expected you an hour ago. And who is this with you?" "Ah, my lord, I did not realize you had accompanied my daughter." "I was enjoying the market," Alexander said smoothly. "Your daughter is an excellent guide." Edmund's eyes flicked between them, and something unreadable passed across his face. "Indeed. Well, the saffron is what matters. Claire, take it to the kitchen." "Yes, father." She curtsied and turned away, but before she could go, Alexander spoke. His voice was low, meant only for her. "The honey cakes. You said they were the best in the county?" She looked back. "They are." "Then I will save the first one for you." Claire felt her cheeks grow warm. She did not know what to say. She, who always knew what to say to tired strangers, so she simply nodded and hurried toward the kitchen, the bundle of dried flowers pressed against her chest. That night, in her small room, she pressed the blue cornflowers and the yellow tansy into a new page of her book. Next to the old pressed lily of the valley, she looked at the 3 flowers for a long time. The lily had been there for years, a memory of her mother. The cornflowers and tansy were new, bright, full of the day they had come from. She had not planned to keep them, but he had been there when she bought them. And now the flowers seemed to hold the shape of his quiet attention, the careful way he had held the pressed lily, the softness that had cracked his voice when he spoke of his mother. She closed the book and set it on the windowsill. Somewhere in the guest wing, Alexander sat by his window, looking out at the dark garden. The parcel of honey cakes lay on the table beside him, unopened. He had told her his mother's words about winter. He had not told her that his mother had died when he was 12, or that his father had forbidden him to speak of her at the funeral, or that he had carried her memory in silence ever since. He had not told her that he was not Lord Blackwood. He had not told her that he was the Alpha King. He thought of the pressed lily in her hand, the way she had said return as if it were a promise. He thought of the honey cakes, and the old woman's sharp eyes, and the way Claire had looked at him when she showed him the flower, as if he were not a lord, or a king, or a weapon, but just a man who had lost something and did not know how to find it. He reached for the parcel, then stopped. He was saving the first one. For her, he did not know why. That felt like the most important promise he had made in years. The night before the harvest feast, the air over Ashford Manor turned cold and still, the way it often did in deep autumn, when the oaks held their breath before shedding the last of their leaves. Claire stood at the kitchen window watching the last light fade beyond the hills and thought she had never seen the yard so quiet. Then Mara came bustling through the door with a basket of turnips and a face full of suspicion. "Someone's been busy while we were all gaping at the sky," she announced, setting the basket down with a thump. "There's a stack of kindling by the back door, split clean as a whistle and piled higher than my hip. Did you do that, child?" Claire turned from the window, genuinely puzzled. "I've been inside all afternoon. I thought Father had arranged for the wood to be brought up from the lower shed." "Your father arranged nothing," Mara said flatly. "I checked that shed myself 3 days ago. It's empty as a sermon after the priest runs out of sins to name. Someone went out and split a winter's worth of firewood in one night, and they did it quiet enough that not a soul heard an axe." She shook her head, muttering one of her favorite sayings under her breath. "Dog doesn't mind a poor house, but a poor house minds a cold hearth. Whoever it was, they've saved us from a miserable feast day." Claire said nothing, but something tugged at her chest. She pulled her shawl tighter and stepped out the back door into the cold dusk. The woodpile stood against the wall, neat and solid, the split faces pale and fragrant where the fresh oak had been opened. She ran her hand over the topmost logs. They were still slightly warm. She did not knock on the guest wing door. She was not sure what she meant to say, but when she rounded the corner of the house toward the small courtyard where the guests often took the evening air, she saw him standing by the well, drying his hands on a scrap of cloth. Alexander did not turn at the sound of her steps, but she saw his sure things stiffen slightly, the way a man does when he is caught at something he did not mean to be seen doing. "Lord Blackwood," she said softly, and the name still tasted strange on her tongue, a borrowed title for a man she was beginning to suspect wore it loosely. He turned then, and in the fading light she saw the raw red blisters rising across both palms, the skin already beginning to peel near the base of his thumbs. He made a small movement, as if to hide his hands behind his back, then stopped and let them fall at his sides. "It seemed the house was short of fuel," he said, as if that explained everything. Claire looked at the blisters, then at the wood pile, then back at him. A strange tightness gathered behind her ribs. Not anger, not pity, but something warmer and more complicated. In her whole life, no one had ever done a quiet, useful thing for her house without wanting credit for it. Her father's generosity always came with a ledger attached. "Why would you do that?" she heard herself ask, and her voice came out smaller than she intended. "You are a guest. Guests are not meant to split firewood." He looked at her for a long moment. The wind moved through the yard, carrying the smell of wood smoke and turning leaves. "A guest who eats a house's bread and sleeps under its roof should leave it warmer than he found it," he said. "That is what my mother used to say." It was the second time he had mentioned his mother. Claire tucked the words away like a pressed flower. She did not answer. She simply turned and walked back into the house. Through the kitchen, where Mara raised an eyebrow, past the pantry, to the small shelf where the household kept its medicines. She filled a basin with warm water from the kettle, found a clean cloth and a small pot of salve that smelled to beeswax and lavender, and carried them out to the courtyard without a word. Alexander was still standing by the well. He watched her approach, and for a moment his face held something unfamiliar, a flicker of surprise that he did not quite manage to hide. "Sit," she said, and it was not a request. He sat on the low stone edge of the well. She knelt before him, set the basin at his feet, and took his right hand in both of hers. His skin was rough and calloused in places, but the blisters were fresh, tight, and angry. She dipped the cloth in the warm water and pressed it gently against his palm. He drew a sharp breath but did not pull away. "This will help," she said, keeping her voice low. "The salve is Mara's own mix. She swears by it for everything from a burlap burn to a broken heart." A small, unexpected sound escaped him, something between a breath and a laugh. "Does it work for broken hearts?" "I haven't had occasion to test it myself," Claire said, working the salve gently into the broken skin. "But I've seen it mend a good many blistered hands." He was quiet for a while, watching her fingers move over his palm. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It felt like the kind of quiet that settles between two people who have stopped pretending. "You don't have to do this," he said at last. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm doing it." He looked at her then, really looked, and she felt the weight of his gaze like a hand resting on her shoulder. In the half-dark, his gray-blue eyes held something she could not name, something raw and unguarded. "My mother," he said slowly, "used to walk the village in winter, carrying bundles of kindling to the old widows and the families whose fathers had gone to the wars. She never told anyone. She would come home with her hands cracked and bleeding, and my father would scold her for being wasteful with her time." He paused. "She used to say that a fire is not a kindness because it is big. It is a kindness because it is there." Claire's hand stilled on his. A knot rose in her throat. She thought of her own mother, gone 4 years now, and the small, quiet ways she had shown love that no one had ever praised. "I think," Claire said softly, "your mother would be proud to see you splitting firewood for a house that is not your own." Alexander did not answer, but his hand turned under hers and his fingers closed gently around her wrist, not gripping, just holding, as if he were anchoring himself to something solid. They stayed that way for a long moment, the basin of water growing cold between them, the wind moving through the courtyard. Then Claire pulled her hand free, not rudely, but gently, and reached into the pocket of her apron. She drew out a small, worn book, its spine soft with age. She opened it to a page near the middle, where a pale, dried flower lay pressed against the yellowed paper. "This is a lily of the valley," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My mother taught me to press flowers when I was small. She told me that this one means return. She said that the people we love are never truly gone, because they always find their way back to us, in one way or another." She looked up at him. In the dim light, his face was unreadable, but his eyes were bright. "I don't know why I'm showing you this," she admitted. "I've never shown anyone before." Alexander looked at the pressed flower for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was rough, as if the words were being pulled from somewhere deep. "My mother died when I was 12, he said. "My father forbade me to speak. From her at the funeral, he said a man does not weep in public and that her memory belonged to the past." He swallowed. "I have not spoken of her to anyone since, until tonight." Claire closed the book slowly, pressing the flower back into its pages. She did not say that she was sorry, because she understood that sorry was not what he needed. Instead, she reached out and took his hand again, the one she had just salved, and held it between both of hers. "Then I am honored," she said, "that you chose to speak of her to me." The wind picked up, carrying the first hint of frost. Somewhere in the house, Mara began to sing an old harvest song in her cracked, cheerful voice. The smell of baking bread drifted through the open kitchen door. Alexander looked at their joined hands, then at Claire's face, lit faintly by the light spilling from the kitchen window. Something in his expression shifted, softened, like ice beginning to thaw at the edges of a winter stream. "Claire," he said, and it was the first time he had said her name aloud. Just her name without a courtesy or a title. It sounded like a question and an answer all at once. "Yes?" He hesitated. Then he said, "Thank you. For the wood, for the salve, for the flower, for not asking me to be anyone other than who I am." She smiled, and it was a small, quiet thing, but it reached her eyes. "I have not asked you anything at all, Lord Blackwood, except to sit still while I tend your hands." He almost laughed again. "That is the hardest thing anyone has asked of me in years." They sat together on the edge of the well until the basin grew cold and the kitchen light dimmed. He did not tell her that he was the Alpha King. She did not ask, but something had changed between them, something that did not need a name or a title. When Claire finally rose to go inside, she paused at the door and looked back. He was still sitting by the well, his hands resting on his knees, his head bowed as if in prayer. "Mara's salve works best if you leave it on overnight," she said. "Don't wash it off." "I won't," he said. She went inside. She did not see him reach into his pocket and draw out the parcel of honey cakes still unopened, and hold it in his salved hands like something precious. She did not hear him whisper, to no one but the cold night air, "Return. I think I understand now." But she did dream that night of a pale flower blooming through snow, and when she woke, The first thing she did was open her book and look at the lily of the valley, pressed flat and patient, waiting for its season to come again. The morning of the harvest feast arrived wrapped in a pale gold light, the kind that made even the worn stones of the courtyard look new. Claire woke with the taste of her dreams still clinging to her, that pale flower blooming through snow, patient and unafraid. She pressed her fingers to her eyes and smiled, a private, foolish thing, before she remembered where she was and what the day demanded. Mara found her an hour later in the kitchen, staring at a pot of porridge that had gone cold while she was somewhere else entirely. "You look like a hen that sat on a duck egg," Mara said, shoving a wooden spoon into her hand. "Stir, the guests will be here before you finish daydreaming." "Am I that obvious? You've been stirring the same pot for a quarter of an hour, and the porridge is still cold." "Yes, you're that obvious." Claire stirred. The porridge remained cold. She did not say anything about the man by the well, or the way his voice had cracked when he spoke of his mother, or the way he had looked at the thing pressed flower in her book, as though she had handed him a key. Some things were too new to be spoken aloud. Some things needed to stay folded in the chest of her heart, like a letter not yet ready to be mailed. The harvest feast was the largest gathering Ashford Manor had seen in years. Long tables were set in the great hall, dressed in linen that had been beaten clean and pressed flat. The air smelled of roasting venison and honeyed apples, and the sharp green tang of pine boughs hung along the rafters. Candles were lit early, their flames swaying like small golden dancers in the draught. By mid-afternoon, the guests had begun to arrive. Lords and ladies from the neighboring holdings, farmers who had earned their place by dint of good harvests, a handful of traveling merchants who had been invited to display their wares. Claire had been assigned to help pour the wine. It was not a position of honor, nor was it meant to be. It was simply where her father had placed her, the way one places a chair against a wall. Useful, unobtrusive, easy to overlook. She did not mind. She had learned long ago not to mind. But this morning, for the first time in weeks, she found herself wishing she had a dress that felt less like a shadow. She had worn her plainest blue-gray gown, the one with the faded hem and the mended sleeve, because she had not wanted to seem as though she was trying to catch anyone's eye. Now she wondered if that had been a mistake. Alexander arrived with the other guests, dressed in the same dark gray travel cloak he had worn the first night, though it had been brushed clean, and the leather beneath it looked darker, more deliberate. He was introduced as Lord Blackwood of the Northern Holdings, a man of quiet means and quieter manners. Claire watched him from across the hall as he inclined his head to her father, accepted a cup of mulled wine, and found a seat near the middle of the table, not the head. He did not look for her. Or perhaps he did, but she looked away first, suddenly embarrassed by the memory of the well, the salve, his raw hands in her palms. That had been last night. This was today. The distance between them had somehow grown wider in the hours between. The feast began with speeches. Her father stood and raised his cup and told the story about the stag he had hunted in his youth, the one he told every year, the one that grew more impressive with each telling. The guests laughed. The wine flowed. Claire moved between the tables, filling cups, keeping her eyes on the dark liquid and the rim of each goblet, trying not to let her gaze drift toward one particular figure in the middle of the hall. She was filling the cup of a stout lady from the eastern fens when she heard it. Two men behind her, their voices low but not low enough, the kind of murmur that assumed itself private because the speaker was too deep in his cups to care. "They say he's the one, the Alpha King himself, traveling under a borrowed name. Blackwood? You're certain?" "Certain as I'm standing here. My cousin serves in the Northern Guard. He saw him at a muster last spring. Same scar above the brow. Same way of sitting like he owns the ground under his chair." The wine bottle in Claire's hand tilted. A thin stream of dark red spilled over the rim of the lady's cup and pooled on the white linen, spreading like a slow stain of dust. "Careful, girl," the lady snapped, jerking back. "You've ruined my sleeve." Claire righted the bottle. "Forgive me, my lady." The bottle was heavier than I thought. She did not remember setting the bottle down. She did not remember excusing herself. She only remembered walking, one foot after the other, out of the great hall and into the cool corridor beyond, where the sound of laughter faded to a muffled hum behind the heavy oak door. "The Alpha King." She pressed her back against the stone wall and closed her eyes. The words repeated themselves, patient and cruel like a bell tolling in an empty church. The Alpha King, traveling under a borrowed name, the scar above the brow, the way of sitting like he owned the ground under his chair. It was him. It had always been him, and he had let her call him a tired traveler. He had let her wrap him in her father's old cloak. He had let her kneel before him with a pot of salve and tend his hands like he was a common man with common hurts. He had let her believe for one fragile, careless night that she had seen something in him that no one else had seen. She had been so proud of that, so foolishly, naively proud. Claire opened her eyes and looked down at her hands. They were trembling. She had taken his hands last night, those same hands that had held her father's roof together out of what she now understood to be a king's charity, and she had thought, what had she thought? That he was a lonely lord in need of kindness, that she, plain Claire Ashford, could offer him something no one else could? He had let her believe it. That was the part that stung worst of all. She walked back to the kitchen, keeping her head low. Mara was at the hearth stirring a pot of gravy, and took one look at her face and set the ladle down. What's happened? Nothing. I spilled some wine. I need a moment. Mara did not press. She simply reached up, pulled a small key from a hook above the hearth, and pressed it into Claire's hand. Go to the pantry. Sit on two. These think somehow. Think somehow. He flour sacks. No one will find you there. She paused. And don't come out until your hands stop shaking. I'll tell your father you're unwell. Claire took the key. She did not thank her, because she did not trust her voice to make it through the word. She slipped into the pantry, closed the door behind her, and sat down on a sack of rye flour in the dark. The silence was cool and smelled of dried herbs and apples. She sat there for a long time, her knees drawn up to her chest, her arms wrapped around them, and she let herself feel it. The strange, aching weight of having been seen and then realizing she had never truly been seen at all. He had come to her father's house in disguise. He had let her mother's flower mean something to him. He had spoken of his mother with a crack in his voice, and she had believed it was a gift, a secret entrusted to her alone. But secrets, she thought bitterly, were only secrets when they were kept from someone who mattered, and she was just the plain daughter of a minor lord, a convenient pair of hands to pour his wine and salve his blisters and nothing more. She stayed in the pantry until the candle stub on the shelf burned down to a puddle of wax. Then she straightened her dress, wiped her face with the back of her hand, and went back out into the hall. The feast was still going, the laughter had grown louder, the wine more generous. Claire returned to her place at the side of the room, picked up a fresh bottle, and moved through the tables with a face as smooth as glass. She did not look at him, not once, but she felt his gaze on her, following her as she moved from guest to guest, filling cups and never meeting his eyes. She felt it like a hand reaching for her in the dark, and she stepped around it every time. It was near the end, think. When the candles had burned low and the musicians had begun to play a slow, swaying tune, that he found her. She was clearing a tray of empty cups near the side door when his voice came from behind her, low and careful. "Claire?" She did not turn around. "My lord, please, look at me. I have cups to clear, my lord." "Claire!" His voice was quieter now, and something in it, something almost like hurt, made her hands tighten on the tray. "I was going to tell you. I was waiting for the right moment." She turned then. She did not mean to, but she turned. And she looked at him. And she saw that he had followed her out of the hall, into the small antechamber, where the empty cups were stacked. The door stood ajar behind him, and the music drifted in, tinny and distant. "The right moment," she repeated. "And what moment would that have been, my lord? After you left? After you rode back to your kingdom and forgot the name of the girl who pressed a flower into your hands?" "I would not have forgotten. You are the Alpha King." She said it plainly, without accusation, without drama, just the words, laid out on the table between them like a thing too heavy to deny. "You came here in disguise to judge my father's house, and I—" Her voice caught, and she hated it, hated the way it betrayed her. "I was foolish enough to think you were someone who needed me." He took a step toward her. "You were not wrong. Wasn't I? You were the first person in years to look at me and see nothing but a tired man." His voice was rough, scraped raw. "Do you know what that meant to me? Do you know how long it has been since anyone?" "Since anyone what?" She set the tray down hard on the table. "Since anyone was kind to you without knowing your title?" "That is a luxury, my lord. A king can always find kindness when he takes off his crown. But the rest of us, we have to live without it. We have to be kind anyway, with no hope of reward, because no one is ever going to come to our door and tell us we are enough." He was silent. The music swelled and faded beyond the door. Claire picked up the tray again. Her hands were steady now, and that surprised her. "You should go back to the feast, my lord. My father will wonder where his guest of honor has gone." She walked past him, through the door, back into the warm golden light of the hall, and she did not look back. She did not see him stand there in the empty antechamber, his jaw tight, his fists clenched at his sides. She did not see him close his eyes, or draw in a breath that shuddered, or reach into his pocket and touch the unapumperosk of honey cakes. But when the feast ended and the guests drifted away to their rooms, Claire found her way to her own chamber and sat on the edge of her bed. She opened her book to the page where the lily of the valley lay pressed, flat and pale and patient. She looked at it for a long time. Then she took it out, held it in her palm for one aching moment, and laid it gently on the windowsill where the cold night air could touch it. She did not put it back in the book. She left it there, in the dark, and she lay down on her bed without undressing, and she stared at the ceiling until her eyes burned. The flower had meant return, but some flowers, she thought, were meant to be let go. The morning after the harvest feast dawned gray and heavy, the kind of morning that made the whole world feel like it was holding its breath. Claire woke to find the lily of the valley still on the windowsill, pale and small against the cold light. She had not slept well. She had not slept at thinking there. Oh, really though, she had lain in the dark for hours, staring at the ceiling until her eyes burned dry. She dressed slowly, in the same faded blue-gray dress she had worn the day before. It felt like armor now, familiar and plain. When she passed the window, she did not pick up the flower. She left it where it was, and she told herself that was the end of it. The kitchens were already busy when she arrived. Mara was kneading dough at the long wooden table, her sleeves rolled to the elbows, flour dusting her chin like early snow. The old cook took one look at Claire's face and said nothing, which was Mara's way of saying a great deal. "Edmund is in the great hall," Mara said finally, her voice flat. "He's been asking for you since first light?" Claire's stomach tightened. She had known this was coming. The feast had been a success. The guests had been entertained, and she had spent the better part of the evening avoiding the most important man in the room. Her father would have noticed. Her father always noticed the things that could be used against her. She wiped her hands on her apron, though they were not dirty, and walked to the great hall. Her father stood by the long oak table, a half-empty cup of ale in his hand. His face was red in the way it got when he was working himself up to something. He did not look at her when she entered. He looked at the wall, at the tapestries, at anything that was not horror. "Close the door," he said. She closed it. "Do you know what I heard this morning?" His voice was tight, controlled, the way a rope is controlled before it snaps. "I heard that my daughter spent the entire feast avoiding Lord Blackwood, that she spilled wine on the tablecloth, that she disappeared for nearly an hour and left the other servants to manage the poor and Think, I want to say. Think Claire said nothing. There was nothing to say that would not make it worse. "I invited him here to discuss an alliance," Edmund went on, his voice rising. "An alliance that could secure this estate for another generation. Do you understand what that means? Do you understand how much depends on this? And you—" He finally turned to look at her, and his eyes were cold. "You cannot even manage to be polite to a guest for one evening." "I was not feeling well," Claire said quietly. It was not a lie. She had not been feeling well. She had felt as though someone had reached into her chest and pulled out something she had only just realized she possessed. "Not feeling well." Edmund repeated the words as though they were a personal insult. "You are always not feeling well when it matters. You hide in kitchens and gardens. You dress like a servant. You speak so quietly that no one can hear you. And then you wonder why no one takes you seriously." Claire's throat tightened. She kept her eyes on the floor. "Do you know what the servants are saying?" her father demanded. "They are saying that the Lord Blackwood spent half his time at the feast looking for you, that he seemed disappointed when you were not at your post. And you could have used that. You could have been useful. But instead you ran off and hid, like a child." He set down his cup with a sharp clatter. "You are not a child anymore, Claire. You are a woman of this household, and you have a duty to this family. Your mother would have known how to behave. Your mother would have known how to—" He stopped. For a moment something flickered in his face, something that might have been regret or might have been merely the awareness that he had gone too far. Then he straightened his shoulders and looked away. "Go to your wrap." "Think," he said. "Think about what I have said, and tonight you will apologize to Lord Blackwood for your behavior. You will be gracious, you will be charming. You will do whatever it takes to make him forget this embarrassment." Claire did not move. Something in her chest had gone very still, the way the air goes still before a storm. "Did you hear me?" Edmund snapped. "Yes, father," she said. Her voice was barely a whisper. She turned and walked out of the great hall, closing the door quietly behind her. She made it to the corridor before the tears came, hot and stinging, and she pressed her hand over her mouth to keep the sound inside. She would not cry where anyone could see. She would not give them that. She walked past the kitchens, past the garden gate, past the old oak tree where she had played as a child. She did not know where she was going. She only knew she could not stop walking, because if she stopped, she would have to feel the full weight of everything her father had said, and she was not sure she could bear it. She ended up at the stone steps at the edge of the estate, overlooking the river valley. The sun had begun to sink toward the western hills, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. She sat down on the worn stone, wrapped her arms around her knees, and let the quiet wash over her. She did not hear him approach. She did not hear his footsteps on the grass, or the soft creak of his boots on the old stone steps. She only became aware that she was no longer alone when his shadow fell across her, long and dark in the dying light. She did not turn around. She could not bear to look at him, not now, not after everything. He did not speak. He did not sit beside her, not at first. He simply stood there, a little behind her and a little to the side, as though he was waiting for permission to exist in the same space as her. The silence stretched between them long and full. After a long while she heard him lower himself onto the steps. Not close, far enough that she could pretend he was not there, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence at the edge of her awareness. They sat like that as the sun sank lower, as the amber deepened into gold, and the gold faded into violet. The river glittered below them, and a few birds called out their last songs of the day. Claire watched the light change on the water, and she let herself simply feel the weight of sitting next to someone without having to perform anything. "You do not have to apologize to me," he said finally. His voice was low, rough, as though he had been holding the words in his throat for a long time. "I heard what your father said. I was walking past the great hall. I did not mean to listen, but I heard." Claire said nothing. "You do not have to be charming," he went on. "You do not have to be gracious. You do not have to do whatever it takes. I did not come here to make you perform for me." "Then why did you come here?" The words came out of her before she could stop them, raw and unguarded. She still did not look at him. She could not. "Why did you come here and let me believe you were someone else? Why did you let me bring you hot soup and old blankets and think you were just a tired traveler when you were—" She stopped. Her voice cracked. "When you were never going to stay." The silence that followed was so long that she thought he was not going to answer. "I came here," he said slowly, "because I wanted to see something real." She finally turned to look at him. His face was half in shadow, the scar at his brow catching the last of the sight. There was something vulnerable in his expression that she had not seen before, something that looked almost like fear. "My whole life," he said, "people have looked at me and seen a title, a crown, a weapon. They bow, they flatter, they tell me what I want to hear. And I have learned to read the lie behind every smile, the calculation behind every kindness. I have learned that no one sees me. They only see what I can give them." He looked down at his hands. "When I walked through your door, I wanted to know what it felt like to be seen as a man, just a man. And you—" He shook his head slowly. "You gave me hot soup and an old blanket and asked for nothing. You looked at me and said I looked tired. No one has said that to me in years. No one has looked at me long enough to notice." Claire felt something twist in her chest. She wanted to hold on to her anger, to keep it close and warm, like a shield. But his words were seeping through the cracks. "I should have told you," he said quietly. "I should have told you, the first night, when you handed me that bowl of soup. I did not, because I was afraid that if you knew who I was, you would look at me the way everyone else does. And I had just found the first person in years who did not." The last of the light faded from the sky. The first stars were appearing, faint and tentative, like small acts of courage. "I am not angry that you are the Alpha King," Claire said finally, her voice so quiet she was not sure he could hear it. "I am angry that you let me think I was being kind to a man who needed it, and I was only being kind to a king who was testing me." He did not answer for a long moment. Then he said, "You were kind to a man who needed it. That is the only truth. The title does not change what you did. It does not Think. I felt what I felt." Claire looked at the river, at the dark water moving steadily toward the sea. She thought about the lily of the valley on her windowsill, pale and patient. She thought about her mother, who had taught her that some flowers meant return. She did not say anything, but she did not get up and walk away. They sat together in the dark, two people on a stone step at the edge of a valley, and the silence between them was no longer heavy with anger. It was full and quiet and almost warm. After a long while, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small parcel wrapped in cloth. He held it out to her, not quite looking at her. "I bought these at the market the day we walked through it together," he said. "I was going to give them to you at the feast. I did not know how or when. I only knew I wanted you to have them." Claire took the parcel. She unwrapped it carefully and found a small bundle of honey cakes slightly squashed from being carried for so long. She looked at them. Then she looked at him. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and looked away. And for a moment, in the starlight, he looked almost like the tired traveler she had met on the first night. Claire did not eat the honey cakes, but she did not put them down, either. She held them in her lap, warm against the cold night air, and she let herself stay sitting beside him for a little while longer. Some flowers were meant to be let go, but some, she thought, were meant to be held. The messenger arrived on the third morning after the harvest feast, his horse lathered with sweat and his cloak crusted with dried mud. He came from the northern border, from the small holding of Thornfield, and he brought news that made Edmund Ashford's face go pale as winter linen. Wolves had come down from the hills. Not ordinary wolves, the messenger said, but a pack that moved with purpose, cutting through the sheepfolds and leaving the shepherds' huts burned behind them. 3 men were dead. A child had been taken in the night, and found the next morning, mercifully alive, but frozen with terror, unable to speak a word. "Wolves do not burn huts," Edmund said slowly, staring at the embers in the great hearth. "Wolves do not leave a child alive as a message." The messenger shifted his weight. "My lord, there were tracks, men's tracks, in among the wolves. The pack was driven. Someone set them loose." Edmund dismissed the man with a curt nod and stood for a long time in silence, his back to the hall. When he turned, his eyes found Claire, who had been standing in the shadows by the door, carrying a tray of bread and cheese for the morning meal. "Fetch the steward," he said, "and then fetch our guest." Claire set the tray down and went. She did not ask questions. She had learned long ago that her father's silences were not invitations. Alexander came to the great hall within the hour, dressed in the plain gray tunic he had worn since his arrival. He listened to Edmund's account of the border raid without interrupting, his gray-blue eyes fixed on the map that lay spread across the oak table. "Thornfield is the northernmost holding," Edmund said, tracing a finger along the river that marked the boundary. "Beyond it lies Reaverland. The old chief there has never loved us, but he has kept the peace for 20 years. This is not the act of a man who wants peace." Alexander was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked, "Has the Reaver chief sent any word, any demand, any complaint?" "None." "Then it is not a negotiation, it is a test." Alexander straightened, and for the first time since he had arrived, there was something in his bearing that made Claire think of a blade being drawn from a sheath. "Someone wants to see how Ashford responds, whether we flinch or whether we stand." Edmund nodded slowly. "I will call the levy. We have men enough to guard the border." "You have men enough to guard a border against wolves," Alexander said. "But if this is a test, the wolves are only the beginning. May I see the messenger?" Claire stood by the door and she saw the way her father glanced at the guest as if measuring him. There was something in Edmund's face she had not seen before, a flicker of uncertainty, and she understood that her father was not entirely sure who he was dealing with. She understood, too, that Alexander had let that uncertainty stand. That evening, Claire went to the kitchens to help Mara prepare the evening meal. The old cook was kneading dough with sharp, angry movements, muttering under her breath about men and their wars, and the stupidity of burning good sheepfolds. "Wolves," Mara said, slapping the dough down hard. "Wolves with men's feet. I've lived long enough to know that when a man wants to steal what you have, he first sends a story about wolves." Claire said nothing. She was thinking about the child who had been found frozen with terror, unable to speak. She was thinking about what it would be like to be that small, and to see your world burn. "The border is far," she said quietly. "It will not come here." Mara snorted. "Fear travels faster than any horse, girl, and fear has a way of finding the softest place to land." She glanced at Claire, and her eyes softened, just a little. "You look tired. Sit. I'll make you some of that honey milk the guest likes." Claire blinked. "The guest likes honey milk? Drinks it every night. Or, so the serving girl tells me, says it reminds him of something from when he was small." Mara shook her head. "Funny thing, a man like that, with a taste for honey milk, you'd think he'd want something stronger." Claire sat down on the stool by the fire, and she let the warmth soak into her bones. She did not know why the thought of Alexander drinking honey milk made her feel something soft and quiet in her chest. Later that night, Claire found herself walking past the guest wing. She did not mean to go there. Her feet simply carried her the way they sometimes did, as if the house itself knew where she needed to be. The door to the library was slightly ajar, and a sliver of candlelight fell across the dark corridor floor. She stopped. She had not intended to look, but she did. Alexander stood by the window, his back to the door. He was holding the old leather case, the one she had seen him carry from the first night. He did not open it. He simply held it, both hands wrapped around it, his head bowed, as if he were praying. Claire's breath caught her throat. She had never seen anyone look so alone in her life. She did not knock. She did not speak. She simply set down the small tray she had been carrying, the one with the bowl of hot soup and the thick slice of bread, at the threshold of the door, and she turned away and walked back down the corridor. Her steps soft as falling leaves. She did not look back. She did not know that, a moment later, Alexander turned from the window, saw the tray on the floor, and stood very still for a long time, staring at it, as if he had never seen anything so strange. He did not call out. He did not follow her. He simply bent down, picked up the tray, and carried it into the library. He sat down in the chair by the fire, and he ate the soup slowly, and he did not let go of the leather case until the bowl was empty. The next morning, Edmund summoned Claire to his study. He was standing by the window, his hands clasped behind his back, and his face was gray in the cold light. "I have sent word to the neighboring holds," he said. "We will need their support if the border troubles grow. I have also sent a message to the Alpha King, requesting his aid." Claire's heart stopped. She kept her face still, but her hands found the edge of her skirt and twisted it. "Father," she said carefully, "you have always said that Ashford does not kneel to the crown." "Ashford does not kneel," Edmund said, "but Ashford is not too proud to ask for help when the wolves are at the door." He turned to look at her, and there was something weary in his eyes. "I have written to the king, Claire. I have asked him to send troops to guard our border. I have told him that we will pledge our loyalty in return." Claire said nothing. She was thinking about the man in the library, the one who drank honey milk and held his leather case like a prayer book. She was thinking about the fact that her father had just asked for the aid of the very man who was sleeping in their guest wing. "Will he come?" she asked. Edmund was silent for a long moment. "I do not know. The Alpha King is not known for answering the pleas of minor lords, but I have heard he is a man of honor. I can only hope that he sees the value in our alliance." Claire felt something cold settle in her stomach. She did not know what to say. She could not tell her father that the man he was praying would come was already here, eating their bread, drinking their honey milk, sitting in their library with a dead woman's portrait in his hands. She excused herself and went to her room. The dried lily of the valley lay on the windowsill, where she had left it. She picked it up, and she held it for a long time, and she did not know what she was praying for. That afternoon, a second messenger arrived. This one came from the south, and he brought a letter sealed with the crest of a neighboring house. Edmund read it in the great hall, his face growing darker with each line. "The Reaver Chief has denied all involvement," he said, crumpling the letter in his fist. "He claims the wolves are wild, and that the burned huts are the work of poachers. He says that if Ashford wishes to accuse him, we will have to answer for our slander. Alexander was standing by the fire, warming his hands. He did not turn around. And what does that tell you, Lord Ashford? Edmund stared at him. It tells me that he is lying. It tells you that he is frightened, Alexander said quietly. A man who is telling the truth does not need to deny anything. A man who is frightened denies everything, loudly, so that no one will hear the fear. He turned, and his gray-blue eyes were steady. The Reaver chief is not the one who started this. He is being used. Someone wants to draw Ashford into a war, and they are using the Reavers as their blade. Edmund was silent. Claire stood by the door, her hands folded in front of her, watching the two men. She saw the way her father's jaw tightened, the way he did not quite meet Alexander's eyes. And who, Edmund said slowly, would want that? I have my suspicions, Alexander said, but I will not name them until I have proof. He looked at Edmund, and there was something almost gentle in his voice. Lord Ashford, I did not come here to watch your house burn. I came because I heard that Ashford was a house of honor, and I wanted to see it with my own eyes. I have not been disappointed. Edmund's face flickered. You speak as if you are not merely a guest. I am not merely a guest, Alexander said. He reached into his tunic and drew out a small silver badge, the kind worn by royal messengers. He set it on the table between them. I am the one your letter was sent to. I am the Alfra King. The silence that followed was so complete that Claire could hear the crackle of the fire, the distant call of a bird in the garden. Edmund stared at the badge. Then he stared at Alexander. His face went from gray to white, and his hand, which had been resting on the table, began to tremble. Your Grace, he said, and his voice cracked. I did not know. I have treated you as a common guest. I have... He stopped, and Claire saw the shame flood his face. I have spoken of the king as if he were a stranger. I have failed in my duty. You have treated me as a man, Alexander said. That is not a failure. That is a gift. He picked up the badge and tucked it back into his tunic. I did not tell you my name because I wanted to see whether Ashford was a house that welcomed men or a house that welcomed titles. You have shown me that it is the former. I will not forget that. Edmund bowed his head. He did not speak. Claire slipped out of the room, her heart pounding. She went to the kitchen, and she stood in the warm steam of the hearth, and she did not know whether to laugh or cry. She had given the Alpha King a bowl of soup at his door. She had given him an old cloak in the rain. She had told him he looked tired, and she had meant it, and he had not minded. He had drunk her honey milk, and he had eaten her soup, and he had sat beside her in the dark and told her things he had never told anyone. She did not know what that meant. She only knew that, for the first time in her life, she had been seen, and it terrified her. The decision came to Alexander not in the council chamber, and not in the cold light of morning, but in the middle of the night, when he stood at the window of his guest room and watched the moon drag its pale light across the hills. He had spent 2 days reading reports and listening to Edmund's anxious talk of alliances and honor and what the neighboring lords would say. None of it moved him. What moved him was the memory of a child's silence, the small boy from Thornfield who had not spoken a word since the wolves came, and who sat now in a healer's cottage with his hands folded in his lap, staring at a wall that held no answers. Alexander had seen that look before. He had worn it himself, at 8 years old when they told him his mother was gone. So at dawn, without telling anyone, he saddled his horse and rode north with 3 of his most trusted men. He left a single note for Edmund, weighted on the desk with a stone. I am going to look at the border. I will return before dark. Do not follow. Claire found the note an hour later when she brought fresh bread to the study. She read it twice, and then she folded it carefully and put it back where it had been. She did not tell anyone. She only went to the kitchen and she took down the clay pot of honey, and she set it on the counter where it would be ready when he came home. The trail to Thornfield ran through a narrow pass between 2 ridges, where the oaks grew close and the ground was soft with fallen leaves. Alexander rode slowly, scanning the earth with the eye of a man who had tracked enemies across worse country than this. He found what he was looking for just past midday, a place where the underbrush had been trampled, not by wolves, but by boots, many boots, moving in a line heading south toward the village, and then turning back, north, in a neat retreat. He dismounted and crouched low, running his fingers over the prints. They were not the ragged marks of desperate men. They were even deliberate, spaced like the steps of soldiers who had been taught to walk lightly and leave little behind. Someone had driven those wolves, or led them, and then had walked away with the discipline of a trained hand. His youngest man, a scout named Thomas, squatted beside him and frowned. "These are not Reaver's men, my lord. Reaver's folk fight with axes and loud voices. This is quiet work." "Exactly," Alexander said. He stood and brushed the dirt from his hands. "Reaver is a loud man with a loud sword. Someone has used his name to make noise while they themselves move in silence. The question is, who benefits if Ashford and Thornwood go to war?" They rode the line for another hour and found the second piece of the puzzle at the edge of a rocky stream. A small camp, cold and abandoned, with the remains of a fire and a bundle of wolf-hide whips coiled in a leather sack. Not traps, not spears, whips. Someone had driven the pack like cattle. From behind, the way a huntsman drives game toward a waiting net. Thomas picked up one of the whips and turned it over. On the handle, burned into the wood, was a mark, a crossed arrow and a pine bough, the sigil of the Greywater clan who held the lands east of the Thornwood. Alexander looked at the mark for a long moment, and then he smiled, and it was not a warm smile. The Greywater lord has been whispering in Reaver's ear for a year, telling him that Ashford's lands are rich, and Thornwood's protection is weak. He wants Reaver to be the sword that strikes, so that he can step in and pick up the pieces when both houses are bleeding. "Then we have him," Thomas said. "We have the truth," Alexander corrected. "The truth is a quieter weapon, but it cuts deeper." He tucked the whip into his saddlebag and swung up onto his horse. "Now we go home and decide what to do with it." He was back at the Ashford manor before the evening bells, and he did not go to the study or to his room. He went first to the kitchen, where the smell of bread and stew hung warm in the air, and where Claire was standing at the table with her back to him, her hands deep in flour. She did not turn when she heard his boots. She only said quietly, "There is honey milk in the pot by the hearth. It is still warm." Alexander stopped in the doorway. He had ridden hard for hours, seen the marks of a conspiracy, and made the kind of decision that could shape the fate of two houses. But for a moment, none of that felt as real as the sight of her, flour on her sleeves, not asking where he had been or what he had found. He crossed the room and lifted the clay pot. The milk was warm, sweetened with honey, and he drank it standing at the hearth, letting the heat settle into his chest. "Thank you," he said. She nodded, still not turning. "Edmund is in the study. He has been pacing all day." "Let him pace a little longer." Alexander set the pot down. "There is something I need to do first." He left the kitchen and walked to his room, and he took the old leather case from beneath his bed. He carried it down the hall past the study, where Edmund's voice rose and fell in worried monologue, past the windows where the last light of dusk was fading to gray. He did not go to the study. He went to the small garden shed at the edge of the yard, where Claire kept her dried flowers, and her pressed leaves, and her quiet hours. She was there, as he had known she would be. She sat on a low stool by the window, a pressed flower in her fingers. The little white bell, the one she had shown him, the one her mother had taught her. He closed the door behind him and sat down on the floor across from her, the leather case in his lap. "You asked me once," he said, "what I keep in this case. I did not tell you. I am sorry for that." Claire looked at him and she did not look away. "You do not have to tell me now. I want to." He opened the clasp, and the lid fell back with a soft creak. Inside, wrapped in a length of faded silk, were two things: a small portrait painted on wood, and a folded letter, yellowed with age. He took out the portrait first. It showed a woman with dark hair and gentle gray eyes, a faint smile at the corner of her mouth, wearing a simple blue dress with a lace collar. She looked kind. She looked tired, the way kind people often do. "My mother," Alexander said. "She died when I was 8. My father never spoke of her after that. He burned her letters, her clothes, everything. But he kept this portrait, hidden in his study, and this letter, the one he wrote to her and never sent." He unfolded the letter carefully. The ink had faded to brown, but the words were still clear. He read them aloud, his voice low and steady. "My dearest Eleanor, I do not know how to love you. I was never taught. I was told that a man protects and provides and stands firm, and that these things are enough, but I have stood firm all my life. And it has not taught me how to say what I feel. I know only that you are the one person who makes me feel that I am not merely a title, but a man. I do not know how to say this, I have never known, but I think you have a... I swallow know it, even when I could not speak it. If I die before I learn to say it properly, I hope you will know that it was true. Alexander stopped. His hand trembled, just slightly, and he closed his eyes. He never sent it, he said. He was too proud, too afraid. He waited, and then she was gone, and the letter stayed hidden for 20 years until I found it after he died. Claire was very still, the pressed flower laying her palm, white against her skin. She looked at the portrait, and at the letter, and then at him. Your father did not know how to love, she said softly, but your mother knew that he did. She knew it even if he never said it. Because love is not only in the words, it is in the standing firm, the protecting, the staying when it would be easier to walk away. She paused. She knew Alexander, I am sure of it. He looked at her, and for a long moment he could not speak. No one had ever said that to him. No one had ever taken the weight of his father's silence and turned it into something gentle. He reached out, slowly, and took her hand. Her fingers were dusted with flour and warm, and they did not pull away. All my life, he said, I have been afraid that I am like him, that I will stand firm and protect and provide and never learn to say the thing that matters. But you look at me the way she looked at him in that portrait, as if I am not a title, as if I am just a man. Claire's eyes filled with tears, but she did not let them fall. You are not just a man, she said. You are the man who drank my honey milk and ate my soup and sat beside me in the dark and told me about your mother. You are the man who built a wall of firewood for a kitchen that was not yours. That is not a title. That is a heart. Alexander let go of her hand, and instead, very carefully, as if she were something precious, he reached up and touched her face, brushing the edge of her jaw with his thumb. I came here to look at a house, he said. I did not expect to be seen. Neither did I, Claire whispered. He did not kiss her. It was not the moment for that. Instead, he let his hand fall, and he reached into the leather case one more time, and he drew out a small thing she had not seen. A pressed white flower the same as hers, faded but still whole. My mother pressed this, he said. She kept it in the case with the portrait. I found it after my father died, and I have carried it with me ever since, though I never knew why. Claire looked at the flower, and then at her own, and a small, wondering smile crossed her face. Bellflowers, she said. My mother said they mean return, she said. They grow back every spring no matter how cold the winter. Alexander looked at the two flowers, side by side, his and hers, separated by years and by distance, but the same. Then perhaps, he said, I have been carrying my way back to you and I did not know it. Claire did not answer in words. She reached out and took his hand again, and she held it, and they sat in the garden shed as the dusk turned to dark, two pressed flowers between them, and the weight of 20 years of silence finally beginning to ease. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, soft and silent, on the fields of Ashford. The snow that had begun the night before did not stop with the dawn. It fell soft and patient over the fields of Ashford, turning the brown autumn earth to a quiet white. And the old manor house stood against it like a ship at anchor, its windows glowing warm against the gray sky. Claire woke early. She lay still for a moment, listening to the hush of the world outside, and she thought of the garden shed, and of the two pressed flowers lying side by side, and of the way Alexander had held her hand as the dark came down. She had not slept much, but she did not feel tired. She felt for the first time in her life like a door had opened somewhere inside her, and light was coming through. She dressed in her plainest dress, the blue-gray one, the one she always wore, and she went down to the kitchen before anyone else was awake. Mara was already there, stirring the porridge pot with one hand and muttering about the cold. She looked up when Claire came in, and her sharp old eyes softened just a little. So, she said, the snow has come, and you are still wearing that dress. It is comfortable, Claire said. It is old, Mara said. But it suits you, it always has. She set a cup of warm milk on the table with a spoonful of honey stirred in, and she pushed it toward Claire, without a word. Claire wrapped her hands around the cup and let the warmth seep into her fingers. Mara, she said quietly, do you think a person can change? Truly change, I mean. Not just pretend to be different, but become different, inside. Mara looked at her for a long moment. Then she went back to stirring the porridge. A dog does not become a cat because you paint its ears, she said. But a dog can learn to trust a hand that has only ever struck it. That is not changing what a dog is. That is changing what it believes about the world. Claire drank her milk and said nothing. An hour later, the whole household was summoned to the great hall. Edmund Ashford stood at the head of the long table, his face pale and uncertain, and beside him stood Alexander, no longer in the plain gray traveling cloak, but in the dark leather and green cloak of his true station. The Alpha King of House Thornwood, standing in the manor of Ashford with the snow falling outside the tall windows, Claire stood at the back of the hall, among the servants, and she watched him. He looked different now, taller somehow, and graver, but his eyes found hers across the room, and for just a moment, the gravity softened into something quieter. My people, Edmund said, and his voice shook a little. I have called you here to hear a truth that has been kept from you. The man you have known these past weeks as Lord Blackwood is in truth Alexander of House Thornwood, the Alpha King of Aldervale. A murmur ran through the hall. Faces turned, wide-eyed, toward the tall man in the green cloak. I have also learned, Edmund went on, that the attacks on our borders, the wolves, the fear, the blame cast upon our neighbors of Reaver, were not what they seemed. The true hand behind them was the Lord of Greywater, who sought to set our houses against each other and claim the ruin for himself. He looked at Alexander, and there was something new in his face, not fear, but a kind of reluctant respect. The king has brought us proof, Edmund said, and he has offered us his protection, not as a demand, but as a pledge of friendship between our houses. The hall fell silent. Then someone at the back began to clap, and the sound spread until the whole hall was full of it. Not the thunder of ceremony, but the honest sound of people who had been afraid and who had learned that the fear was over. Alexander raised a hand, and the clapping died down. I did not come here to be praised, he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the hall. I came to see with my own eyes what kind of people lived in this village. Think. He hid his eyes, and what I found was not what I expected. He paused, and his eyes moved to the back of the hall, to where Claire stood. I found a house that welcomed a stranger without knowing who he was, he said. That gave him warm soup and an old cloak and a place by the fire. Not because he was important, but because he was tired. That is a kind of wealth that no king can command, and no enemy can take away. Claire felt her cheeks grow warm. She looked down at her hands, at the worn fabric of her blue-gray dress, and she did not know where to put the feeling that swelled in her chest. The hall emptied slowly, people drifting out into the snow with new lightness in their steps. Edmund lingered, and Alexander turned to him, and the two men stood alone by the great hearth. I owe you an apology, Edmund said heavily. 20 years ago, when your father sought a union between our houses, I refused him. I thought him cold, unfeeling. I did not want my family bound to a name that carried so little warmth. Alexander was silent for a moment. My father was a hard man, he said. He did not know how to show what he felt, but he wrote a letter once, to my mother. A letter he never sent. It said that he did not know how to love, but that she was the only person who made him feel alive. Edmund looked at him, and something in his weather face seemed to crack, just a little. I misjudged him, Edmund said, and I misjudged his son. You judged by what you could see, Alexander said. That is not a sin. It is only a limitation. We all see through our own eyes. They stood together for a long moment, two men who had carried the weight of an old coldness for 20 years. And then Edmund held out his hand. Alexander took it. The afternoon passed slowly. The snow continued to fall, a lift, and the manor was quiet, full of the soft hush of a world wrapped in white. Claire helped Mara in the kitchen, and she tried not to think about the way Alexander had looked at her across the hall, but she could not stop thinking about it. When the light began to fade, she slipped out through the back gate and walked down the path to the river. The river was half frozen, its edges crusted with ice, its center still moving dark and slow. She stood on the bank watching the water, and she thought about her mother, about the bellflowers and what they meant, and whether they would really come back in the spring. "You are early for the first bloom," said a voice behind her. Claire turned. An old woman stood on the path, wrapped in a shawl of gray wool with a bundle of dried herbs at her belt. Her face was lined with years, but her eyes were bright and knowing. "I am not looking for blooms," Claire said. "No," the old woman said. "You are looking for something that grows in winter. That is a harder thing to find." She came and stood beside Claire, looking out at the frozen river. "Bellflowers," she said. "Their roots go deep into the coldest ground. That is how they survive. The frost cannot touch what is buried deep enough." Claire looked at her. "How do you know about bellflowers?" The old woman smiled. "I knew your mother," she said, "and I knew another woman, long ago, who pressed a bellflower into a book and carried it with her all her life. She was the mother of a king, and she was the gentlest soul I ever knew." Claire caught her breath. You knew Alexander's mother?" "I delivered her son," the old woman said simply. "I was young then, and she was young too. And we were both afraid, but she held my hand and told me it would be all right, and it was." She re-ate. Thinking it soaped like around. "The bellflower does not mean waiting," she said. "That is what most people think. But your mother knew better. It means return. The root stays in the ground, through the snow and the dark, and when the time is right, it comes back. Not because it waited, but because it never truly left." She let her hand fall and stepped back. "Go home, child," she said. "Someone is waiting for you at the door." Claire turned and looked back toward the manor. Through the falling snow, she could see a tall figure standing in the open doorway, the light from the hall spilling warm around him. When she reached the house, Alexander was still standing there, waiting. He had taken off his cloak and he held something in his hand. A small dried flower, pressed flat and fragile. The bellflower from his mother's book. "I have been standing here for some time," he said. "I wanted to come and find you, but I did not know if you would want to be found." Claire looked at him, at the snow on his shoulders and the flower in his hand, and she felt something open in her chest, something warm and steady, like a root putting down into cold ground. "I would always want to be found," she said. "By you." He held out the flower and she took it, turning it gently between her fingers. It was the same as hers, the same shape, the same faded color, the same promise. "I have made many decisions in my life," Alexander said. "I have commanded armies and settled disputes and walked the length of this kingdom in the name of peace. But the best decision I ever made was the night I walked into this house, tired and unknown, and you gave me a bowl of soup without asking who I was." Claire laughed, a small wet sound. "It was only soup." "It was not only soup," he said. "It was the first time in years that someone saw me as a man who might be tired, rather than a king who must be strong." He took a breath, and then he knelt in the snow, there in the doorway of the manor, with the light warm behind him and the winter cold around them both. "Claire of House Ashford," he said, "I do not have a crown to offer you that would be worth more than what you have already given me, but I have a name and a house and a heart that has learned because of you what it means to be soft. Will you be my wife?" Claire stood very still. The snow fell around them, soft and silent, and she looked at this man. This king who had knelt in the snow for her, who had carried his mother's flower for 20 years, who had learned to be gentle because she had shown him it was safe. She reached down and took his hand. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will." She pulled him up and they stood together in the doorway, and she lifted the bellflower to look at it one more time. The promise her mother had taught her, the root that never truly left, the return that came in its own season. "The flowers will bloom in the spring," she said. Alexander wrapped his hand around hers, the flower between their palms. "Then we will wait for them," he said, "together." Inside, the fire burned warm, and Mara was already muttering about how she would have to bake a proper wedding cake, and the snow fell on the fields of Ashford like a blessing, and for the first time in 20 years, the house did not feel cold. Claire wore her plainest dress, but she was the only one who truly saw the Alpha King. Sometimes, a simple act of kindness holds more power than any crown. Would you have recognized the king in disguise? Let me know in the comments. If this story warmed your heart, hit like and subscribe for more romance.